Hello and welcome to GameSack. We're back to check out some more games that do some impressive things for the hardware that they run on. And by we, I mean you and I together, not, the royal we. Speaking of royalty, the Queen died today, this very day that I'm recording right here. And that should give you an indication of how far ahead I shoot these episodes, as I'm sure that's ancient news by now. But the Queen would have loved this episode, most of which was made while she was still alive. The 16-bit era was her favorite, so let's start out with something from back then. Here's Lawnmower Man for the Super Nintendo from the Sales Curve and THQ. Yeah, I know I just showed a clip of me effortlessly inserting the Genesis version, but I've got to talk about the Super Nintendo version first. This game is basically a side-scrolling run-and-gun at heart. You control Pierce Brosnan himself as he shoots down bad guys in a virtual world. As you make your way through the levels, you're encouraged to grab lots of CDs, because that's the data storage format of the future. You can also collect gun upgrades, score bonuses, and what appears to be armor. Regardless, it's usually one hit and you die. As you can see, it looks pretty simple, certainly nothing special about what the console is doing here. Well, every other level, you get to fly through 3D lands. Sure, it kind of looks like Atari 2600 graphics in 3D, but keep in mind that there's no Super FX chip here and no help from Mode 7. Yet it moves briskly at a very solid 30 frames per second. There are lots and lots of these stages, all taking place in a slightly different area. Every once in a while, you'll stop to inflict some punishment, Pierce Brosnan style, on these digital bad guys. There's a stage called the Cyber Run, which does in fact use Mode 7 for its floor and ceiling, and it looks fairly cool. Due to the assistance of Mode 7, this one runs at 60 frames per second. At a couple of parts during the stage, you even get a solid vertical wall, which is unusual to see with Mode 7. There's also a rotating tunnel stage, which is cool, but it probably isn't pushing the console much. The final boss fight with Job also uses Mode 7. That's all pretty cool for the console, but let's also check out the Genesis version from Time Warner Interactive. All in all, the graphics here have fewer scrolling layers in the 2D stages and also fewer colors, not that there were many to begin with. The quality of the sampled audio, like any voices and also the drums, will disappoint pretty much everyone. But the 3D stages are still here and run at the same locked 30 frames per second. In fact, they look the same, just without the fog style effect. The control in these stages on the Genesis feels a bit faster, but really it doesn't make it much easier. These stages are a lot longer in the Genesis version for some reason. Not sure if I'd say that's really a good thing. The Cyber Run stage actually looks a bit better than the Super Nintendo version in my eyes for a couple of reasons. One, it's just a bit more interesting, and two, it actually rotates the screen when you move left and right. It also runs at 60 frames per second here. This stage was already pretty long on the Super NES, and it's about twice as long here. The tunnel stage also looks better on the Genesis with these cool colored tubes that you fly through. Other than the visuals though, it plays the same. The final boss really impresses given the hardware limitations of the console. Keep in mind that the Genesis has nothing like Mode 7, that's right, no hardware scaling at all. Yet Job's face smoothly scales in and out as you shoot him. And the scaling is at 60 frames per second, just like Mode 7. It even gets incredibly blocky, just like the Super Nintendo. And come on, who doesn't love that? Honestly, this really blew me away, and I can't recall seeing any full-screen scaling on the console this good. Overall, I think the Super Nintendo version is probably a bit more playable and it feels more refined, but the Genesis version really struts its stuff late in the game. All in all, this title is a decent time, just don't play the Sega CD version. Wipeout was one of the earlier games on the PlayStation in 1995. This future combat racer from Psygnosis was pretty impressive in its time. It ran at a smooth 30 frames per second, which some people these days would deem unplayable. Oh well, their loss, I guess. There is quite a bit of pop-up involving the not-so-distant imagery, but this was all acceptable back then. It didn't stop anyone from enjoying this one. Wipeout XL came out the very next year. This one improves some things, though it still has some noticeable pop-up. Still a great game, though. It wouldn't be until 3 years later when we finally got Wipeout 3. Yeah, this is the title screen. I mean, it even tells you that it's the title screen on the title screen, so there can be no confusion. It's much better than other title screens like the original Wipeout. Is this the title screen? Wait, no, maybe this one is the title screen. Which one is the title screen? I can't tell! Someone help me! Wipeout 3 makes sure your brain cells aren't too stressed out by making it clear in no uncertain terms. As a game, it's still pretty darn good. The frame rate retains the same 30 frames per second as the last two games. But what makes this one special is that the horizontal resolution has increased from 320 pixels wide to 512 pixels wide. That's 60% more pixels on screen, which is nothing to scoff at, especially given the hardware. Not only that, but almost all pop-up or draw-in has been eliminated or hidden, at least in the single-player mode. By 1999, nobody wanted that in their games anymore, so they did a great job of concealing it. Lastly, there's even a widescreen mode. This is slightly wider and slightly cropped on top and bottom compared to the normal 4x3 mode. And even with this enabled, it still runs at 30 frames per second. The music is pretty cool as well. Overall, this is a great game, and it's one of the very few games on the original PlayStation that has a true anamorphic widescreen mode, which is only made better by the increased resolution.
Engaged. Energy drained.
High-resolution games always impress me, so let's take a look at some games from the 16-bit era that ran in a high resolution. You know, for the Queen. Damn, she loves 16-bit. This is RPM Racing, or Radical Psycho Machine Racing from Interplay for the Super Nintendo. This, honestly, is a game that could appear not only in a Games That Push Hardware Limits episode like this one, but also a Games That Make the Console Look Weak episode. I mean, just look at it. This game really chugs, and it doesn't have much to look at. At a glance, you might think that the Super NES was the weakest thing around if this was the only thing you ever saw running on the machine. But why the hell is it in this episode? Well, if you look closer, you'll see that this game runs in a high-resolution interlaced mode. This increases the vertical resolution from 224 lines to 448. Not only that, but the horizontal resolution has been doubled to 512 pixels for this game. Check out how finely detailed the pixels in the background are. The vehicles are the normal resolution that the console runs in, and they appear blocky in comparison to the background. If you look at it in super slow motion, the sprite graphics are just duplicated for both the odd and even lines, while the background updates as the screen interlaces. I'm not sure why the sprites can't be in high resolution as well, but the fact that the rest of the game is pretty significant on the console. All of the menu screens and the title screen are in high resolution as well. There is a lot of sharp detail that you usually didn't see in games from this era. Unfortunately, that makes this game run really slow, so it'd be nice to have an option to disable it. But the fact that this exists is pretty damn impressive. Now, if you're looking for a game like this, but actually one that's fun to play, then check out Interplay's Rock and Roll Racing, which came out a year and a half after this one. Another game on the Super Nintendo that uses interlacing is Air Strike Patrol, though the cool kids call this one ASP. This game is basically a dollar store version of Desert Strike, but the menus use high resolution. The only thing that really benefits here is the text. Oh, and this guy who supports you on your mission gets the high-res treatment as well. It's in his contract. The main game is in normal resolution. Then there's Power Drive, which I don't believe was ever released in the US, as I can't find a US ROM. Anyway, this overhead game interlaces for its menu screen where you repair your car between races. It looks extremely sharp, except for the spinning car in the corner. Once again, the main game is in normal resolution. Next, there's Ranma 1/2, Chou Nai Geku, and its Western counterpart, Street Combat. The entirety of both of these are completely interlaced, but not in high resolution. As a result, it looks blockier on a CRT than normal games. There's no reason at all for these games to use interlacing. The only thing gained is some screen jiggle as it bounces up and down on a CRT. I do not recommend playing these turds at all. The Super NES test program, which wasn't available to consumers, also cycled through some interlaced screens as it ran through a gamut of tests. There are probably more games on this system that interlace that I missed, so please let me know. The Genesis has some interlaced stuff too. Does anyone remember a game called Sonic the Hedgehog 2? If not, you should definitely check it out, it's a hidden gem. Anyway, the 2-player mode uses interlacing to fit 2 full-sized playfields on screen at once. As a result, the screens are squashed all to hell vertically, but the Genesis is still displaying 2 full and independent screens at once, mostly at full speed, which is damn impressive. Only the vertical dimension is doubled, unlike what the Super NES can do, but it's still quite nice. This was the very first time I ever saw a video game interlace. It was so different and odd that I immediately took notice of this effect. I was amazed at how much sharper the little details were. I remember after playing this and going back to the single-player mode how I felt that it looked soft and a touch dim in comparison. I wondered why they couldn't just make the entire game interlaced in the proper aspect ratio with twice the detail. In retrospect, I'm glad that they didn't, but those were my thoughts at the time. Combat Cars from Accolade also does this same thing. The normal single-player mode is the full screen. The 2-player mode is interlaced and squashed, just like Sonic 2. Ys 3 on the Genesis has an interlaced mode in its configuration menu that you can enable or disable at any time. This does absolutely nothing except making the screen jiggle since no extra resolution is added, just like Street Combat on the Super Nintendo. I think the programmers must have just put it in here because it amused them. If I missed any Genesis or Mega Drive games that have interlacing, please let me know. I am not done talking about high-resolution 16-bit games though. Here's Kirby's Dream Land 3 for the Super Nintendo, for example. This game doesn't interlace like all of the ones I just mentioned do. In fact, at first glance, it doesn't look like there's anything special at all about the resolution. That's because the game runs at the console's normal 256 pixel wide resolution, or at least it appears that way. However, any and all foreground graphics that go on top of Kirby and the main playfield run at a resolution of 512 pixels wide. If you look closely, you can see that the foreground graphics are striped to create a pseudo-translucency effect. Back in the day, most people played on extremely crappy TVs with composite video or RF video connections. This would effectively blur it so that you wouldn't see the stripes, though it still wouldn't look quite as clean as a layer with true translucent effect like the system can do, mainly due to the moire, or moire, I don't know. I'm gonna go with moire. I'm not sure why they didn't just use a normal transparency layer, but hey, here you go. Still, it's a pretty cool way to do it. Other games like the setup screen and Secret of Mana, whatever, use the 512 pixel wide resolution. This here is an example of Mode 5. Everyone's familiar with Mode 7, but Mode 5 here doesn't get any love. Not that it really needs it. The scrolling background and the text have a higher horizontal resolution, but the other graphical assets on the screen are normal. Of course, it goes without saying that the main game is completely normal resolution all the way through. There are a few other examples on the console where the text is rendered in high resolution, but the main game is the normal resolution. That's pretty cool that the console can basically do 2 resolutions at once. Lastly, the TurboGrafx 16, aka the PC Engine, can also do high resolution, and it was part of that same era. The best examples are the Sherlock Holmes games, both Volume 1 and Volume 2. Notice how the pixels are taller than they are wide. This is because these games run at a resolution of 512 pixels wide, just like those Super NES games I was talking about moments ago. Except the TurboGrafx is technically 8-bit, so it might be pushing hardware limits a little more here. The text does benefit a little from the high resolution here, but honestly, I'm not sure why they chose to present this game entirely at 512 pixels wide. The Sega CD versions of these same games run at only half the resolution.
Watson. Inspector Lestrade, my good man, I'm looking into the cause of James Windibank's death.
Not many games on this system run in high res.
Briefcase open, contents askew, but not stolen. It's an open and shut case.
Was anything else found at the scene that could be of use to us, Inspector?
I doubt it.
TV Sports Basketball does, for the player select screen anyway. I guess maybe because it needs all this text on screen. Everything else, including the main game, takes place at a lower resolution. The Japanese game Asuka 120% runs in high resolution, but only for the story text. Basically, everything on the lower half of the screen is presented at 512 pixels wide, but everything up top is normal. There are a lot of medium-ish resolution games for the system as well. There are no games on the platform that use interlacing. If I missed any 512 pixel wide high resolution games on the TurboGrafx 16/PC engine, please let me know. Alright, let's mix it up with some more modern stuff. Now, don't worry, it's still technically retro. I can see some of you starting to get worried because it's too new, but I'll even sprinkle some 8-bit stuff in there. Doom 3 came to the original Xbox in 2005 from id Software, Vicarious Visions, and Activisions, among other platforms. This was quite the departure for Doom. Instead of just being thrust into the action, the game now has a story and other things that you need to go through before you're allowed to really get into it. In other words, it's a normal story-driven FPS game, but for its time it was certainly something special, especially here for the Xbox. It's also basically a horror game. The graphics here are extremely ahead of their time on the console. If you didn't know any better, this could be mistaken for an early PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 game. There's just so much detail everywhere, and everything is sharp all the way into the distance. The lighting is also extremely well done. The game is dark, and that's entirely intentional, and I love the way your flashlight lights things up, and you'll need to use it a lot. Your weapons will also produce flashes of light when you fire them. The game performs admirably on the console given the level of detail, maintaining an almost rock-solid 30 frames per second. Not only that, but the game supports 480p as well as true anamorphic widescreen. In addition to that, the sound is just superb if you have the console hooked up in Dolby Digital. You get creepy sounds all around you, which adds to the horror environment of everyone else getting ripped up out of your view. Doom 3 Resurrection of Evil came to the Xbox later that same year. This is basically like an expansion pack for Doom 3, or DLC would be the proper term these days, but you don't need to own the original Doom 3 to play this. That right there is probably pushing hardware limits from today's perspective. This one has the same great graphics, lighting, widescreen, and sound as Doom 3. It also features this grabber gun which can send enemy projectiles right back at them. It's pretty damn fun to use. Either of these titles is a great way to flex the strength of your original Xbox. So invite over all of your PlayStation 2 fanboy friends and show them this. They will go home crying. Well, probably not, since the PS2 has an immensely better library, but you get my drift. Here's Alien 3 on the Sega Master System, which was only released in Europe. This one was made by Probe. It's a port of the Genesis version where Ripley needs to rescue everyone with all of the guns that she didn't have in the movie. Unfortunately, if you're used to the Genesis version, this one is pretty sluggish. The jumping physics feel a little wonky and the collision takes a while to get used to. What's cool about this one though isn't the gameplay. Definitely not the gameplay. However, it actually has overlapping parallax scrolling done in a manner very similar to the Genesis game. I've talked about this technique before, and it's done by animating the background tiles to give the illusion of overlapping parallax with a single background layer. That means they actually have to put in extra work just to achieve this effect when they didn't really need to. It's just extremely rare to see this on the Master System, so it stands out quite a bit on the console. There's really not much more to say about this one, at least on the technical front anyway. This is Asterix and Obelix XXL on the Game Boy Advance. This 2004 game was only released in Europe. You can get it on other consoles like the PlayStation 2 and even remakes for modern consoles, but let me remind you that this is the Game Boy Advance. This is a 3D platform game running on hardware that is decidedly not 3D. And you know what? It kinda works okay. The gist of the game is to make it to the end of the stage, and to do that you need to kill a certain number of bad guys to be able to activate certain things in a given area. Then you move on. You collect helmets for currency. You can run around anywhere and you're not simply limited to back and forth like Crash Bandicoot, for example. That's right, Crash Bandicoot can go straight to hell because this is Asterix and Obelix XXL for the Game Boy Advance. You can turn the camera at will with the L and the R buttons. Yeah, if you're watching this on anything bigger than a modest phone, this looks like a messy jumble of pixels. But you get used to it and it still works pretty well. The Game Boy Advance doesn't have the world's best perspective correction or anything, so things can get really warpy. So warpy that they make original PlayStation textures look nice. Still, the fact that the Game Boy Advance is basically a Super Nintendo on steroids and it's doing this is pretty damned impressive. It's too bad that the audio is quite awful, but hey, it's the Game Boy Advance. And here's another jumbled mess of pixels if you're watching on a decent-sized display. That's right, it's Gunstar Heroes for the Sega Game Gear. This was only released in Japan and is a port of the Genesis game originally made by Treasure. M2 handled this port and they did quite an admirable job. Well, graphically anyway. Keep in mind that the Game Gear is basically a portable Master System with some extra colors and fewer pixels. M2 did their damnedest to keep everything that they could. There's even some multi-segmented bosses, and I don't think I've ever seen anything like that on this hardware before. Some things have been compromised, like Stage 2, where you're now floating on a personal helicopter thing and you make it to the boss rather quickly. Stage 4 is completely gone, but no one is going to miss the dice maze. Good call, M2. Unfortunately, these sparkly guys take forever and a day to kill and they grow tiresome instead of fun. Bad call, M2. There's even some parallax, which is pretty crazy for this hardware. This makes me wonder why they didn't try these things when the hardware was younger, especially back in the Master System days. They even made a valiant effort with the music and added stereo, which is something that a lot of Game Gear games don't bother with. This game makes me feel like M2 felt that they had something to prove, and I think they proved it, whatever it was. Unfortunately, the game has significant control lag and there is so much flicker that it's nearly unplayable in my opinion. Seriously, it's really easy to lose yourself in the flicker. Still, I don't think I've seen any game push the Game Gear this hard. Have you? Shenmue on the Sega Dreamcast was pretty amazing in its day. The game was way ahead of its time, perhaps too much. But I still prefer the originals over the HD remasters, mainly because of all the bugs in those. These days this game has been surpassed, so it's hard for gamers that didn't experience it originally to get into it. Still, there's no question that everything about this was incredibly ambitious, including its extremely detailed environments. And let's not forget about the memorable character dialogue.
Nozomi.
Ryo,
You got a minute?
Yeah.
Oh, no. I changed my mind.
What? You don't trust me?
I'm sorry.
So talk to me.
Yeah. I'll be back later.
Shenmue 2 was even more ambitious when it came to its visuals. Like, substantially more ambitious all around. Both the original and this game were certainly pushing the console pretty hard with everything that these games demanded. But what I want to focus on here is the Shenmue Passport Disc, which is the fourth disc that was included in the original game. Here, you could load your save and listen to some of the music or watch some of the events that you've already experienced in the game. You could even connect online and do mundane online things. But there's also a section where various characters from the game explain certain aspects of the gameplay to you. These use extremely detailed 3D models. Yeah, they kind of look silly today, but back then we had never seen any 3D human this detailed and smooth in any game ever. It's almost like Toy Story quality graphics. Basically, it's using all of the Dreamcast power just on these faces, as the characters don't really move around much, if at all. However, you can control the camera to an extent, zoom in and out, and even adjust the lighting on the fly in real time. It's almost as fun as playing with Mario's face on Super Mario 64, but not quite. I wish the faces in the game proper could be this detailed, but sadly that's just not possible. This was a fun little glimpse into the kind of graphics that we'd be seeing on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3.
This fusion of simplicity and agility makes Shenmue a thrilling experience for all. Oh yes, I nearly forgot. There's no need to worry even if you fail. Even if you make mistake upon mistake, there's still a story for your progression. Do you know about QTE battles? Chai shall explain it for you. Yes, he will.
And there you go, more games that impressed technically in one way or another, or at least they impressed me. I'd like to make a part 10 in the Pushing Hardware Limits series, and I figured there are probably enough games out there for one more. But what do you recommend? What should I put in that episode, and why do you think they push the hardware? Let me know. In the meantime, thank you for watching GameSack. Watch Zelda make you paranoid on your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Zelda!
Eat hot rocks!
Which way to go? Click!
Green dog!
Trash can food! Zelda! Zelda! Zelda!
The Legend of Zelda. You too can be on crack with your Nintendo Entertainment System.
Green dog, I mean Zelda!